So I'm standing before you, proudly proclaiming that I'm previously disadvantaged and proud of gone to education and miraculously got out of my Indian ghetto and managed to become a human rights lawyer and activist. And thankfully for people who are not lawyers, who taught me the most about lawyering and what it means to be a public interest lawyer. And fortunately for me, and even though I hate identity politics, and I think that's why Greg asked me to specifically focus on gender, it's not ordinarily a topic that I would discuss, because I think a lot of our issues in society are broader than just around narrow identity politics, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's sexual orientation, and our struggles are much broader. But today, the particular issue of patriarchy in the legal profession is something that is worrying, is concerning, is increasing at dangerous levels, and I think needs to be addressed. So fortunately, I was one of those clerks who was able to clerk for a constitutional court judge who happened to be a woman. Unfortunately, 20 years later, we still only have 2 constitutional court judges who are women on our bench. At one point, we had 3, but then obviously when Kate and Justice Reagan and Justice Makoro stepped down, we now have 2. And I think that that's quite an indictment, actually, 20 years later in South African society, that given the pool, the breadth and expertise of smart women lawyers, advocates, legal academics, legal professionals, lecturers, etc., that we aren't able to actually find a larger pool of women that we can appoint to the Constitutional Court, and wait till we get to the stats about the High Court judges as well. So I'm not ordinarily a feminist. I think of myself as an activist. But today, like I said, that I think there's a specific focus on gender that we have to look at, but it's more related to patriarchy. And so I think that what often happens is that the race issue in South Africa, and in this discussion about transformation of the judiciary, and I should say this is very difficult for me because I clerked for Justice Reagan when Justice Yacoub was actually at the court, so I think he still imagines me as this constitutional court clerk. And we would have long arguments about what we have to do in order to change the society in which we live in. And the Constitutional Court clerks of the Constitutional Court would often engage in quite serious and quite heated debate with the judges around particularly the values of judges in relaying what their judgment should be in specific socioeconomic rights cases. And I remember there was an evolution, I don't know if you remember, Judge, because Justice Yacoub actually wrote the Grootboek judgment, and the Constitutional Court clerks banded together to take a delegation together to all the judges to say that we wanted certain things included in the judgment because of what it would actually represent in terms of the symbolic value. Of course, they didn't listen to us. But nevertheless, it's still one of the best judgments of the Constitutional Court. So I'm just going to give you some stats, and that's just merely to shock you so that you understand why I'm talking about women today. In 2011, only a quarter of all our High Court judges were women. According to media reports, less than 4% in 2012 of women at the bar, and that's all around the country, are actually senior black women. So all the silks, the ones with the red bags, the legal counsel, there's very few who are actually black women. So when you are government, when you are the private sector, when you're a drug company, when you are the NGO sector, and you want a smart black woman to be senior counsel, there's very few women that you can actually brief. Usually they've already been briefed on retainer by government, and in some cases the private sector. The bar, of course, one of my bugbears, 72% still made up of white people, and I don't have anything against white people, but these are issues that we need to address. And only 16% are African, and Indians and coloreds don't even count, so their percentages are quite negligible. I mean, they hardly feature in this post-democratic debate about what transformation means. So I think Indians are at 8%, coloreds are at 4%. And I've already mentioned that only 2 women constitutional court judges. So I think what Greg wanted me to talk about is, given the particular issues with gender and patriarchy, and it's a profession that, you know, people don't want to admit, but it's still largely sexist. I've been at the receiving end of that, and if one more person calls me my dear girl, you know, I'm going to have to do something more serious. But yeah, I practiced for 20 years, obviously in the human rights sector, so we came across a lot of patriarchy and sexism. I've worked in government, and patriarchy knows no boundary. It extends into government as well, and it also extends, and let's be honest, into the NGO and civil society sector. So I suppose the question that Greg wanted me to say is, looking at section 174, looking at the realities of our past, which we can't ignore, looking at the race and gender issues, what then is appropriately qualified and what then is fit and proper. And I think it links back to what Justice Yaqub talked about earlier in relation to what is the political and what is the political views or what are the values of particular candidates who make up our legal profession and our judiciary. And in that respect, then I think the executive summary that Justice Kadere put together around this whole review of our entire judiciary, where they talk about a developmental state, I think is particularly relevant to what Justice Yaqub talked about in terms of political considerations becoming more paramount than race and gender in terms of consideration. And it's the values of people's politics, and it's the values in terms of the approach to executive deference, to the approach in terms of judicial activism that actually will determine, I think, a large number of our appointments going forward. Because, for example, the ANC government is going to be more comfortable with taking a white woman who is particularly deferential to the executive than taking a black man who has made very clear articulations about the fact that government too is one arm of government and has to be accountable to the values and the spirits of the Constitution, not accountable to the ANC. So I think when we're looking at the criteria, and it's also something that Justice Yaqub talked about, for me, and this is now where I go away from the identity politics, is that race and gender, yes, and patriarchy are serious issues, and we need to look at that, and we need to particularly focus our energies on how we mentor and support women in the profession as well as women for appointment to the judiciary. It's going to obviously be the question of class. So I don't know when we'll have the day when there'll be a black woman judge from Khayelitsha who has a very different life experience, who has a very different set of values. And it could be one of those young activists who are sitting at the back from Ndifuna, Ukwazi, or Equal Education or Social Justice Coalition, will be on our bench and will bring that particular perspective and input into court deliberations, whether it's in a High Court judge or whether it's in a Constitutional Court. Or will we always have, when we're talking about race and gender transformation, will we have people who came from Model C schools and people who were fortunate enough to have parents who then had sufficient resources to put them into private schools? And so it's the veneer of transformation as opposed to a truly representative demographic on our bench. So for me, I think I may sound like a bit of like a socialist and Marxist, but I'm not. It's really an issue about class, and it's really an issue about values, and what is it that we should include in that criteria when we decide to appoint judges. And I think it relates to what Advocate Smuts mentioned earlier around how much focus and attention is there by people who make up the Judicial Service Commission, and obviously the composition will change over time. So I think getting into personalities detaches us from the real issue around the process and what questions they ask, and how much attention is actually being paid to people's values and how they approach our constitutional jurisprudence, and how they see the three arms of government operating and who should actually be deferential to whom. My final sort of point is, because I don't want to go over the 10 minutes and we can't really say a lot about this. I'm not going to tell you whose interview this was. And this was the reason why I decided to actually focus on gender and the issue of patriarchy in the profession. And I think two issues have come up in the presentations, is that women who now decide, if you're going to use the pool of people in the next 20 years that's going to be available for selection for High Court judges or for the Constitutional Court, then the pool ordinarily and traditionally, unless we radically change it, which is what I think Advocate Smuts is suggesting, is that it's going to come predominantly from the bar, right, from the legal profession. There's very few women in that bar. So what do we do that's going to be radical now, so that in 20 years' time we have a greater pool of women who for 9 months have to self-support themselves, because you go into pupillage at the bar. There is no real fellowship that I'm aware of. I think the late Justice Langas tried to start something, but there's hardly any private sector or government investment in that program. So for 9 months you have to support yourself. If you're a single mother, if you're in a relationship, if you're in a same-sex relationship with children, you basically, there's no support for you. There's no after-school care. There's no bar sort of creches that can be provided, or whatever you call that. You can say I don't have children. So I think the point is that if we talk the talk, then we're going to have to walk the walk, and we're going to have to find the resources and investments. And it's actually something as simple as that. provide funding for a woman in KwaZulu-Natal, in Gauteng, in the Western Cape, to go 9 months to the bar, make sure that senior counsel, who are invariably white old men, will actually mentor them and look after them and take them into their fold. Make sure that they have enough support to be able to study for that exam so that they pass it and are able to enter the bar, and make sure that they get briefs. And one of the requirements could be that government gives them briefs, but also then the private sector and anybody else. So unless you actually invest in some kind of program, which over the next 20 years, you then maybe have 15 or 20 women who over time would have become senior counsel, who would then be eligible, and guarantee you in the next 20 years we're going to be having similar discussions about why there's so few women on the bench. So I'm going to read something to you and then I'm going to end, Greg. I'm not going to tell you whose interview it was or when it happened, and whoever gets a good guess, except for the lawyers in the bar will probably know the answer, will get a chocolate. So he says, I propose this question of youth, Professor. I am concerned not so much with your age, but the age. Now, this is a person being interviewed for a constitutional court judge appointment, okay? So one of the questioners says, I propose this question of youth, Professor. I am concerned not so much with your age, but the age of your children. You live in Cape Town, do you not? Who's the spoiler in the room? Thank you. So she says, I do, yes. And you have small children? I do, I have 2 small children, one who is 5 and one who is 3. How are you going to manage it with the court sitting here in Johannesburg? Fortunately, I am married to somebody who accepts the responsibility of parenting as much as I do. And I think his attitude is fully supportive. He is a practicing advocate, but accepts that he will have to move his practice if we came to Johannesburg. Oh, you would move to Johannesburg? Yes, certainly, he would accept that. Oh, that answers my question. Thank you.